Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar presentation today on the final guidelines for the new multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA communities. We will run through a presentation momentarily. I do want attendees to know that this will be recorded and made available on our website. We will also make a copy of the deck available on the website for those that take notes. I just want you to know that resource will be available subsequent to this presentation. As you may notice, we will not be taking questions today, but we certainly will have plenty of opportunities after this presentation to engage in a dialogue with you all. So with all that said, I will pull up the screen and give you presentation here. So again, this is a webinar on the final guidelines for the new multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA communities. We are going to run through a slate of sections here, the housing crisis and the importance of TOD zoning, the final guidelines, the compliance model, and technical assistance. So with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Mike Keneally to take us through section 1 with respect to the housing crisis and the importance of TOD zoning.
Well, Rory, thanks so much. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's an important topic. Glad to have your time and attention to talk about the final guidelines. I do want to acknowledge all the folks on my team, many of whom you'll hear from in this presentation. This has been a terrific team effort, both across HED and our quasi agencies, and frankly, across the administration. So deeply grateful to the efforts of my team to get this one right, and look forward to the presentation today. Why don't we go to, so I'm going to open up with just a few slides to kind of set the table on why we think this is important. This will probably not be new content for a lot of folks, but talk about the housing crisis in Massachusetts generally and the importance of TOD zoning. So on the housing crisis, I've been saying now for a long time in our administration and our team, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, myself, and others, we've been using the term housing crisis for a very long time, long before we ever heard of COVID-19. We've had a challenge now for a long time in producing enough housing for our families, our workers, for an aging population. We'll go through some of the stats that drive our view that we are in a crisis, but suffice to say, the housing crisis impacts our people in a very meaningful way and their ability to access housing that's affordable to them. It impacts our communities. I hear so many times from municipal leaders as I travel the state about their aspirations for how they want to develop their communities and how the lack of housing production is an impediment to that. And finally, in a very meaningful way, it impacts our ability as a state to compete economically against other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So we are in a housing crisis. It has many dimensions with impacts on people and cities and towns and economic competitiveness. And that highlights the importance of this zoning reform and the efforts to get more housing zoned and ultimately produced around the state. Let's go to the next slide. So for some comparison here, we are right now in July, these are July 2022 numbers. We're number 4 in the country in home value and number 4 in 2-bedroom rent. So this is not where you want to be. For perspective, in 1980, Massachusetts was at the national average in home value. Now think about that for a second. That's not that long ago. That's 40 something years ago. And I've been here almost my entire life. And I always thought that for all of our wonderful attributes as a state, that we were just a high cost place. Not so. About a generation or so ago, we were average in terms of housing costs. And now we're far at the end of the spectrum here among the 4 highest, both in terms of home value and rent. Let's go to the next one. If you want to understand why we've ended up in that position, I think it does in so many respects come back to the simple dynamic of supply and demand. And so from 1960 to 1990, Massachusetts communities permitted about 900,000 new housing units. From 1990 till today, a similar, a little more than 30-year period of time, it's 490,000. And so in a single generation, we cut in half our level of housing production as a state at a time when our economy grew and our population grew, hence the impact of supply and demand. Rising demand, falling production, rising price. We think now, given this 30-odd year shortfall in production, we're short about 200,000 housing units around the state. And that number, of course, will grow as our state grows. So we've got a problem here, a fundamental problem of lack of housing production in Massachusetts. Next. I've used the term competitiveness a couple of times already. It's a major issue for us. our core competitive advantage is talent, our skilled workforce. And we always want to be in the business of developing, attracting, and retaining talent. And our ability to do so will be handicapped by our level of housing production. And so for comparison, here are 25 major metro areas around the country, the 25 largest, and we're fourth from the bottom in terms of per capita housing production. So think about that for a second. We're fourth highest on housing costs and fourth lowest on housing production. That explains why we are where we are today. But it also suggests that if we keep going, if these trends keep going, that cost dynamic, that cost differential could only become greater. A little more data here on the bottom in terms of multifamily housing production around the state. This one's a little hard to follow, so I'll spend some time on it. But from between 2010 and 2020, the city of Boston permitted about 30,000 multifamily units. So one city, obviously our biggest city, but one city permitted 30,000 units. The next 10 communities, the next 10 highest in terms of housing permitting, did 18,000. So the top 11, if you will, did 48,000 housing units. The next 340 cities and towns did 32,000. And so this suggests that we need to get more housing produced around the state, not have it be so localized here in Boston, but have all communities step up and start to permit, zone for and permit and produce more housing. Next. A little bit on why we think this is so important. We think there's enormous potential with more housing near public transit. We've been saying now for a long time that TOD zoning is good housing policy, good transit policy, good climate policy, and good local economic development policy. And what we tried to illustrate here is just how difficult it's been historically to get multifamily housing permitted. And so this researcher, Amy Dane, did a study in 2019, surveyed 100 municipalities in Greater Boston and looked at how their housing developments were actually zoned and permitted, and concluded that only 14% of the multifamily units produced over a period of time, over a 3-year period of time here, were done through as-of-right zoning. In contrast, 60% required special permits. And as folks on this call probably know better than I do, it's very difficult to get through a special permit process and get something permitted that way. Hence the importance of the potential of this law here to create an easier path to get multifamily housing zone permitted and ultimately produced. Next. I'm going to end here before I turn it over to Chris Clutchman from DHCD and just present the statute. This is the entire statute that governs this new MBTA community zoning mandate. And just to walk through it, the first section says an MBTA community shall have a zoning ordinance or bylaw that provides for at least one district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing is permitted as of right. There's a lot in that first sentence there. MBTA communities, as I'm sure folks know, are defined in statute. There's 175 of them. They're the communities that have public transit or are adjacent to those that do. You needed a zoning ordinance or bylaw that has as of right zoning. It's got to be a reasonable size. We'll spend a lot of time, as we have in prior sessions, on what our view of reasonable size was. And then it's got other metrics here around 15 units per acre and a half mile from public transit where applicable. But I think it's useful to ground any discussion of this in what is in the statute. So this is what we, as the administration, the executive branch, were given from the legislature, what we had to work with. And so this stuff is, the stuff on this page is fixed, if you will, the 15 units per acre, the notion of reasonable size and a half mile. This goes on to say that an MBTA community that fails to comply won't be eligible for three capital programs. We've gotten a lot of questions on this. Does this mean that the only penalty for noncompliance is these three programs? I don't think we should assume that would be the case. I go back to the word shall. And so a community, look, it's a mandate. Communities have to do this. I think the word shall sort of governs that concept throughout. And it charges the department, in this case, our Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, to consult with the MBTA and MassDOT to come up with the guidelines that determine if a city or town are in compliance. And that's what today's discussion is about. Before I turn it over to Chris, I will just say that while this is a legislative mandate that we're executing on here, the spirit with which we approach this is very much one of partnership. At some point in this deck, there'll be a presentation on a very robust set of technical assistance tools. And so the team here is here to help you to get this done. We recognize there's a lot of complexity to this, and you'll get a lot of questions in your community about why are we doing this? How should we do it? That isn't lost on us. And so as important as this is for the future of our state that we get more housing produced and permitted around Massachusetts, And given the enormous potential of TOD housing, it's important we get this one right. And we will approach this, as we do everything on our team, in a spirit of partnership to help you do so. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris Clutchman from DHCD.
Thank you so very much, Secretary Keneally. We hope that the guidelines that we're going to present today provide a clear and flexible approach to compliance that allows cities and towns to develop districts that suit their unique circumstances. And with that, let's go to the next slide. So I want to just give a recap about the process that we went through. As you all are aware, we put out the draft guidelines in mid-December of last year, and then embarked on 24 webinars where we described the those draft guidelines to a whole variety of different communities. And generally these were webinars, and we had back and forth. We also opened up an online public comment portal, and we received almost 400 comments, including letters from 90 municipalities, 25 organizations, legislators, and individuals who just used the online form to give us their comments. To summarize what we heard, we had a lot of support for the basic approach by having community categories based on transit, for including the concept of a multifamily unit capacity. But we also heard from municipalities from small towns about their concerns about the impact of the guidelines and the one-size-fits-all approach, and also from communities with real on-the-ground constraints. And so we took those to heart and made several changes to the guidelines, and we're just going to go over those now. Next slide, please. So this is the beginning of a series of slides where I'm going to start by talking about what the draft said, what we heard from folks, and then what we changed. And so overall, these are going to highlight the biggest changes that we made. I do want to encourage everybody to download a copy of the guidelines from mass.gov MBTA communities so that you can look at all of it, because as we all know, every part of it is important, but these are going to be the highlights. So one of the first major changes that we made is we took a look at the community categories. And so in the draft guidelines, we had 4 categories: subway, bus, commuter rail, and adjacent. We heard from bus service communities that they were concerned that they didn't feel like that fit their community, and they weren't sure about how bus routes that change over time would affect their compliance. And also we heard from smaller and rural communities that all communities were not the same. So what we did is we revised our community categories. We still have 4, but they are now rapid transit, which is the same, similar to subway, commuter rail, adjacent, and adjacent small town. So we focused on fixed transit assets as opposed to bus routes. So these are stations like commuter rail stations or subway stations. We eliminated the bus service category, and we took a look at the adjacent category, which actually in the draft guidelines comprise of 75 communities. And we recognize that all of those are not the same. And so we split that into 2 categories. We have adjacent and adjacent small towns, and we give a special consideration for small and rural towns that don't have transit stations. Next slide, please. So what were some of those changes that we made for small and rural towns? So as I mentioned, we defined adjacent communities in the draft as 75 communities that don't have any fixed transit station in their border or within a half mile. But those communities were still subject to a minimum multifamily capacity of 10%. And also we had a floor of a minimum of 750 units for the unit capacity feature that we unveiled in the draft guidelines. And that was regardless of size. And that was based on the 50-acre minimum size and the 15 units per acre that calculated out to 750. And we heard loud and clear from smaller and rural communities that these were outsized to their existing housing stock, and that several of them had requirements that exceeded the rapid transit communities, which had a maximum of 25% to calculate their unit capacity. And these communities had 30 or 40% of their multifamily unit capacity. So what did we do? We made significant changes for small and rural towns. First of all, we established that new category of adjacent small town. We now have 35 adjacent small town and 59 adjacent communities. We took away the minimum land area for adjacent small towns. So there's no minimum land area. And then we capped the multifamily unit capacity at 5%, whereas an adjacent community has a 10% requirement. And then finally, we heard from those communities that they may have trouble with local capacity. And so we provided an extra year for those communities to come into compliance. Another change that's somewhat related to this is that we started put forward the concept of developable station area in a town. And that did result in some changes to the community categories for several communities. Let's go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we created the concept of developable station area in the final guidelines. The draft guidelines had two factors for reasonable size. At least 50 acres of land, which we felt like was a good area to plan for neighborhoods. It's about 1/10 of that circle of a half-mile radius, which is about 500 acres. But we heard from communities that on the ground realities made this difficult. Some communities had a wedge, just a wedge of area that was in a station area that happened to be within their boundaries. And other communities had floodplains, wetlands, and other real physical constraints that would prevent them from locating their district in that area. This is a requirement that's in the statute, but we felt we needed to make some changes to recognize where's the best place to put multifamily districts. So we have new requirements for developable station areas. We focused on this concept to make it the best place to put multifamily zoning. So we created a couple new definitions, developable land with a very detailed definition. And then we also looked at community categories, and we created a minimum of 100 acres of developable station area to qualify a community with a station area within it or adjacent to it to be in that category. And the best thing I can do here is, I think, give an example. The town of Arlington had been classified as a subway community in the draft guidelines because Alewife, which is actually located in Cambridge, was within a half a mile of Arlington's boundaries. However, much of that half-mile area in Arlington is comprised of right-of-way or wetlands. And so they had less than 100 acres of a developable station area, and their designation changed from subway to adjacent because of that. To balance this, we also came up with the percentage in each district that varies based on how much developable station area is within a community. So communities that have a lot of developable station area have a higher requirement to locate their districts near transit, whereas others have a lower area. Next slide. And and finally, just to go on one of the changes to the reasonable size. Again, we've mentioned a couple times that there was at least 50, in the draft guidelines, we had a 50-acre minimum, and which resulted in that 750 unit floor. Again, we heard from small communities and other communities that this would be difficult and that to meet, and was excessive in terms of their existing housing units, which is one of the factors that we use for the unit capacity figure. And then we also heard about land constraints, especially from communities that are very, very small, geographically small areas. So we made significant changes here. We established a cap or a circuit breaker so that no community has a multifamily unit capacity that goes beyond 25% of an existing housing stock. And then we also created a safety valve for for communities that are small in land area. Think about Nahant or Chelsea that are quite small. And then there's a safety valve so that not more than 1.5% of your developable land area, that the minimum land area would not exceed 1.5%. And then, as I've mentioned already, we eliminated the minimum land area for adjacent small towns. So in total, these changes affected 74 of the 175 communities, but we think really created this tailored approach that addressed the criticism that we had, that there was a little bit too much of one size fits all. And in the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Clark Ziegler, who'll go through a couple more changes.
Great, thanks, Chris. The last notable change we want to highlight today to do with district location requirements and how much of a approved district under the statute needs to be within a half mile of a transit station. The draft guidelines had a pretty much one-size-fits-all approach, and basically it required that at least half of a district of an MBTA multifamily district had to be within a half mile of the station area, and the remainder could be in other locations deemed appropriate by the community, presumably other smart growth locations. And the intent was noble, trying to strike a balance between the statute, which explicitly calls out half mile proximity to transit as a priority, with the desire of communities to have some flexibility in where they locate their districts. We got some very immediate feedback from a number of communities about how this one-size-fits-all approach didn't really fit local circumstances. There was a wide range of differences on the ground, and Chris already touched on this a little bit earlier. But we have some communities that are barely touched, that have a station in an adjacent community with only a tiny sliver of land within their borders. We have other communities that have multiple, and also some of that land, Arlington was the example Chris just mentioned, might be undevelopable. We have other communities with multiple transit stations surrounded by developable land, and the idea of having sort of a single approach to those different widely varying situations didn't make a whole lot of sense. The solution, you can go to the next slide, Rory. The solution in the final guidelines was to build off of the developable station area definition that Chris just mentioned, and to create a sliding scale so that communities that have little or no developable land near a transit stop within their borders are free to locate all of their MBTA multifamily district, in whatever locations they see fit, while communities that have a significant amount of developable land near transit stops are required to locate most of their district within the half mile station of the station. And the best way to illustrate this is an example on this slide. Arlington, which we've been talking about, just has that tiny sliver of land within a half mile of the Alewife Red Line station, and Arlington is free to locate its district wherever it chooses. The town of Needham, as a counterexample, has 4 commuter rail stations, more than 1,200 acres of developable land by this sort of common definition, and is required to locate 90% of its MBTA multifamily district within a half mile of those stations. So the notion here, I think that this is sort of both good policy, but also gives communities discretion to the greatest extent we can while being true to the intent of the statute. Next slide, please. So in combination, Chris mentioned that the developable station area definition affects which communities are falling into which transit categories, and also we just talked about how that also affects how much of the station area needs to be, how much of the district needs to be within a station area. This is the final, sort of after applying all of these calculations of developable land for each community around each station area. This chart basically shows the new distribution of communities by category, and you can see that there is a slight reduction in the number of subway rapid transit communities. There were places, for example, like Wellesley, that had only a tiny sliver of land within a half mile of a Green Line station in Newton, but has a number of commuter rail stations that went from rapid transit to commuter rail. And there's a significant increase in the number of commuter rail communities. A number of them were formerly in the bus category and are really better suited to be deemed commuter rail communities. And then the new distribution between adjacent small towns. So we think this really strikes a good balance, having the obligation for multifamily zoning to fall heaviest on places where there are fixed assets, as Chris mentioned, rail stations, and creating more flexibility in places where there are not. We feel pretty good about how all these pieces have come together. Next slide, please. So there are three other issues I just want to touch on really briefly. First is site plan review. It's very clear site plan review is a common zoning practice in Massachusetts and is done in conjunction with as of right development. And the final guidelines simply try to clarify when and how site plan review is really appropriate in the context of an MBTA multifamily district. The point being that site plan review is appropriately used to reach agreement on key project details, but not to unreasonably delay or obstruct development. And we think that the final guidelines language helps achieve that objective. The second thing I want to touch on is affordability, which is a concern for a number of communities, ensuring not just that we produce more multifamily housing, but to be affordable to folks with low and moderate income. And there are a couple of ways that can be achieved in the final guidelines. The guidelines expressly allow an inclusionary zoning requirement that 10% of the units be affordable to households at 80% of median income. And it also creates a pathway for communities to achieve additional affordability, either as a result of a zoning district that requires statutory approval by DHCD, such as Chapter 40R, the Smart Growth Zoning Law, or through pre-existing inclusionary zoning requirements that predate the enactment of Section 3A that DHCD deems not to impede multifamily development. So there are a number of pathways there that, to promote additional affordability, and we're more than happy to discuss that with individual communities. Last is, there are a lot of other local planning objectives beside multifamily housing, and one objective that comes up frequently is the desire to have ground floor retail space. The final guidelines provide that other uses beside multifamily, standalone multifamily housing may be permitted in an MBTA zoning district, but not required. And the reason being that the law is very explicit that being able to get approval as of right to build multifamily housing on its own is an obligation under the statute. Having said that, we see lots of opportunities for communities that are trying to integrate housing development with other objectives like commercial development, mixed use, retail. We think there are a lot of pathways to achieve that, and certainly cities and towns, once they have met their MBTA zoning district obligation, are absolutely free to provide other zoning options in the same district that might, for example, promote and incentivize mixed use development. So again, we see on one hand, the requirements of the statute are clear, that as of right multifamily zoning has to be in place on its own, but we see pathways for communities to meet the statutory obligation, but also to promote other local planning objectives. And with that, I will turn it back to Chris.
Thank you so much, Clark. Now we're going to get down to some of the nitty-gritty. I'm going to talk a little bit about the compliance timelines and the compliance process. So to give folks an update, for 2022 grant rounds, we had a compliance requirement to submit a community information form, and 95% of the communities did that. In the draft guidelines, we had certain deadlines for compliance and for an action plan, which provides for interim compliance. And what I really want folks to focus on now is the table at the bottom of this slide. And so, as you can see, we kept a similar framework of having full compliance submission by type of transit community or transit category. And so rapid transit communities have, if you go over to the column all the way on the right, have the earliest compliance or district compliance deadline of December 31st, 2023. all MBTA communities have an action plan submission deadline of January 31st of 2023. That's not mandatory, but it is recommended to achieve interim compliance while you continue to work on adopting the multifamily district. So, and then as you can see on this chart, commuter rail and adjacent have a December 31st, 2024 deadline, while the adjacent small towns have until December 31st, 2025. And I'm going to talk about the action plan in the next slide. So the interim compliance is available, again, not required, but suggested that you submit the action plan, which is an online form, which is on mass.gov MBTA communities. And it is a relatively simple form to give us an update about the planning and work that you're doing in your community to achieve full compliance. It provides a place for you to tell us about the districts that you're thinking about. It also provides a way for you to indicate the schedule in which you're going to achieve your full compliance. When those plans are approved, you will be formally in interim compliance and eligible for funding. The interim compliance is only available through the time in which the district compliance is available. And the action plan deadline, again, is January 31st, 2023. I encourage all communities to take a look at the online action plan form. Again, it is relatively simple and asks you to think about how you're going to plan to achieve your full district compliance. And I want to echo what Secretary Keneally said, is we have lots of technical assistance, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to help you get there. We even have technical assistance to help you with action plans if you feel you need it. But I just want to recommend that people take a look at that so they get a sense of what is required for an action plan. Next. So we call, so we've talked about interim compliance, which is the action plan, full compliance, or which is called district compliance in the action, guidelines, is the final requirement. We'll be making determinations in accordance with the guidelines. When you, this will be through an online form, just as the action plan and the community information form were online forms. You may note on the website that the full compliance application is not available yet, and that's primarily because the compliance model, which my colleague Tom Hopper is going to talk about in a little bit, is not final yet. And so it is our plan to have the full application and the compliance model available in November, so later this fall. When you are ready to submit your compliance, we have a couple requirements for what it is you're going to submit. Certified copy of your zoning ordinance and map that provides, that meets the standards and the guidelines. You will be providing an estimate of the multifamily unit capacity and a GIS shapefile of your multifamily zoning district. Again, that compliance model will provide that estimate of multifamily unit capacity, and we will also be providing each community with GIS base maps to help them through that process. And then finally, if you're a town, we would like to see evidence that your clerk, your town clerk, has submitted a copy of your bylaw to the Office of the Attorney General. We don't need you to have approval from the Attorney General's office, but we'd like to see that you've submitted it to them for their approval. DHCD has provided, we have a deadline for ourselves. Within 30 days, we're going to let you know if your compliance application is complete. And then we will be issuing written determinations that you're either compliant with the multifamily requirements, or some reasons why it fails to comply. I should note that there's also going to be, in November, we will also open up a form that will allow you to submit all this information for a pre-adoption review by DHCD. We state that we need at least 90 days to do that, but we understand the effort and the lift it takes to have communities come up with the scenarios and the compliance model, to come up with the text of the zoning bylaw or ordinance. And you may want to see, you may want opinions from us about whether or not it is compliant or in the direction of compliance prior to going through town meeting or through a city council or town council process. So that pre-adoption review will also be available to communities after November. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tom Hopper from Mass Housing Partnership to walk you through the compliance model.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Hopper. I'm the Director of Research and Analytics at MHP Center for Housing Data. Our team at MHP assisted DHCD in the development of a model that will be used by communities and DHCD staff to estimate some of the key benchmarks set forth in the guidelines. So let's jump into an overview of what the compliance model does. Next slide, please. Thanks. First, a little bit about the purpose and function of the compliance model. There are a few quantitative requirements that communities will need to demonstrate compliance against, including multifamily unit capacity and gross density, which have been touched on earlier in today's presentation, and I'll expound upon a bit more in a few minutes. It's important that there's a standard way of evaluating and estimating zoning districts for compliance with 3A, and the compliance model will ensure that all MBTA communities are using a consistent approach to estimate and report multifamily unit capacity and gross density. Because the compliance model will be a required component of a district compliance application, it's also important the model be in a format that's accessible and workable by most local planners and municipal staff members. So while there is some limited mapping and GIS work that will be necessary, most of the compliance model is in the form of an Excel workbook. The development of the model was completed with the input and assistance of consultants and other experts and key stakeholders, including architects, engineers, planning professionals, local officials, GIS professionals, data scientists, and others. And I just want to hammer home a few more key points. First, the compliance model was developed to create a reasonable estimate of unit capacity and is not as rigorous as, say, a build-out analysis or an impact analysis, which some of you might be familiar with. But we know the model will be a useful tool, and we're confident it's been developed in a way that responsibly accounts for key development constraints and dimensional standards. However, not every potential site condition or every contextual factor has been included. Therefore, while the outputs from the model will provide a good estimate and will certainly be sufficient to provide evidence that the zoning district will allow for the required level of unit capacity, it will not provide an absolute measure of development potential. And lastly, while we have created the model in a way that should be workable and accessible to most municipal staff, there will be technical assistance available through MHP and others for any municipality seeking support as they use the model. And Chris will talk a little bit about that in a few moments. Next slide, please. So what is the compliance model? What does it consist of? The compliance model has three major components. First, every municipality will be provided with a geospatial database. This is the component of the compliance model that identifies the geographic boundaries of the district being modeled and contains information about the sites or lots that fall within it. The database also includes information on what portions of parcels or which entire parcels are either excluded land or sensitive land. Excluded land includes things such as restricted open space, water bodies, public land, or one of the other excluded land categories identified in the guidelines. These land areas will not be included in the analysis of unit capacity. Sensitive land includes things such as flood zones, primary habitats for rare or endangered species, active farmland, and other geographic areas that towns might want to be aware of and think carefully about when citing their zoning district. While sensitive land areas will be modeled for unit capacity, towns should use their best judgment about whether these areas are suitable for inclusion in the district. The geospatial database will also include helpful identifying information, such as the lot owner name, address, and the existing use of parcels in the district. Once a district is drawn on the map, the information on the parcels that fall within it will be exported for inclusion in the Excel workbook. And that Excel workbook includes two components. First, a zoning checklist, which will guide users through a questionnaire that collects the dimensional and regulatory standards from the zoning regulation that might have a bearing on unit capacity. So it'll collect information such as minimum lot size, allowable building typologies, required open space, lot coverage, building height, floor to area ratio requirements, and other common elements of zoning that determine the scale and form of housing that's allowed as of right. The final component of the compliance model is a calculator that will use the parcel information from the geospatial database and the information collected in the zoning checklist to derive an estimate of multifamily unit capacity and residential density on every lot in the district, as well as a total district-wide estimate of multifamily unit capacity and gross density. These model outputs will be compared to the requirements for the community as part of the compliance determination process. So that's a quick overview of the role and the structure of the compliance model. As Chris mentioned, the compliance model is not currently available to the public as we're doing some final testing and development to ensure that we're delivering the most useful and clear tool that we can to communities. But the compliance model will be available for use later this fall. Next slide, Lori. Before I hand things back over to Chris, I wanted to spend just a little bit more time on what multifamily unit capacity is, since this is certainly a new concept to some and one that might be a bit confusing, but it's an incredibly important concept to understand when thinking about Section 3A. Multifamily unit capacity is the number of multifamily units that zoning would allow to be built as of right on a given lot. It is not the number of units already on a lot. So you do not count the number of units already in a district to get to unit capacity. Said a different way, unit capacity is a measurement of the maximum number of multifamily units your zoning regulations would allow as of right. And that may differ from what currently exists on the site. So here's a conceptual diagram that might be helpful. Say we have a district that includes this hypothetical parcel where there's an existing two-family structure, a duplex. To estimate the unit capacity of this parcel, we would pretend the existing structure is not there and instead use the lot dimensions and the parameters from the zoning regulation to estimate the maximum number of multifamily units that could be developed as of right on the site. In this hypothetical situation, zoning would allow a fourplex to be developed as of right. So the multifamily unit capacity of this lot would be 4 units. Now, although in this example, unit capacity was higher than the existing development, be aware that unit capacity might also be less than what is currently on the site. For example, if an existing 20-unit apartment building was developed through a special permit process, so not as of right, and the zoning regulations would only allow a 10-unit structure to be permitted as of right, then the unit capacity for that site would be those 10 units, not the 20 that exist today. So hopefully that was clarifying, but if not, there will be ample resources, guides, trainings, and examples available that will help explain, coach, and assist communities in understanding this and other key concepts. So let me hand things back to Chris, who will talk about some of the technical assistance that's being offered to make sure communities receive the support they need to make the most of Section 3A. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Tom. What a clear explanation. Really appreciate it. Can I have the next slide, please? So as everybody has mentioned so far, we're very aware that we want to provide assistance to all communities that need it and want it. And so we've put together a multi-year effort, and we're coordinating across multiple agencies to try and provide that. And because well, I'm a planner, and I'll just say I can't resist a good acronym. We call this 3ATA, and it even rhymes. So just to go over some of the resources that we have already launched and are continuing to launch as things go by, I'm going to go through a couple various programs. I do want to say that it is certainly possible, and again, to emphasize that this is a multi-year effort, and it may be that your community comes in for technical assistance this year, and then they come back in another year for more technical assistance. So don't think about technical assistance as just a one and done. You may have several different touch points of technical assistance from potentially different providers. So specifically, Mass Housing Partnership is going to be developing a comprehensive assistance program available to all MBTA communities, and its application process will start later this fall. And they will have consultants that communities can access. So communities don't have to go through a procurement process. They've already hired and retained consultants that will be available for a variety of different kinds of assistance. For example, assistance with a compliance model if you don't have GIS staff in your community, or maybe what you really want is assistance with public engagement to engage your community to talk about multifamily zoning. So there will be an array of different types of technical assistance through the MHP process. From DHCD, we have 3 grant programs through the Community One Stop that will fund planning related to MBTA compliance. The Housing Choice Grant Program, Community Planning Grants, and the Rural and Small Town Development Fund, which is specifically for towns that would meet the small town definition in the guidelines. We are prioritizing and providing bonus points in those programs to make sure that we're providing assistance to communities who want it. This year's grant process, grant applications were submitted in May, and announcements will be made later this fall. And some communities have already applied for assistance in that process. And then that process, the Community One Stop, will open up again next May or next winter with applications due in May of 2023 for communities who want to access those programs. That is an annual process, and so you have to be alert to when the Community One Stop is open. Don't worry, we'll be continuing to remind folks about the opportunities for the Community One Stop. The agency Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, has a land use planning grant program that is also prioritizing MBTA municipalities. That process was open this past May as well, and will continue to offer priority for MBTA communities in their next grant round. And finally, our partner agencies, the regional planning agencies. There are 8 regional planning agencies that have MBTA communities, and we are working with them to help them prioritize their district local technical assistance and other technical assistance funding that they have available. And in fact, some of the regional planning agencies may be the consultant that MHP provides. So we're actually providing additional funding to the regional planning agencies to allow them to reach more communities through their technical assistance. We understand the regional planning agencies are often a preferred provider of assistance to local communities, and we want to respect that preference. With that, finally, I want to say that while we're not necessarily answering questions in this session, we have a resource on the mass.gov website. If you are confused about technical assistance and are not sure about when these grant rounds are, we have a form called a Technical Assistance Inquiry Form, and I would encourage you to go there. It asks you to provide some information about where you are, and then we will provide you some advice and resources about which program might be best for your community. And that's part of the collaborative coordination that we're doing amongst all these different players to make sure that folks are getting the kind of assistance that they want. So look for Technical Assistance Inquiry Form. And then if you have any questions for us about the guidelines, we've established, and this is on the website, an email, dhcd3a@mass.gov, where you can ask us technical questions about the guidelines. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Undersecretary Jennifer Maddox of DHCD, who will give us some summaries and some key things to think about.
Thank you so much, Chris, Tom, and Clark for your work on finalizing the guidelines and presenting all of this information today. Wow, more than 475 people joined us today, including mayors, town planners, local elected officials, development professionals, and other housing stakeholders. Today's presentation is just the beginning. We have an opportunity to leverage local, state, and federal resources to address our state's housing shortage, increase use of public transit, and build vibrant, welcoming communities. We know these requirements may seem daunting for many, but we have an incredible array of technical assistance, resources, and experts to work with communities. DHCD, MHP, and our quasi-state agencies are eager to work with cities and towns to meet our shared goals on housing production. No one is expecting new buildings to go up overnight in your communities. Our initial focus is to help you build capacity for development over the long term. All of us are deeply troubled by increasing housing costs, and this requirement gives us a strong tool to address restrictive zoning and encourage housing production that prioritizes transit access, affordability, and multifamily development over the long term. We need every city and town to be a part of the solution, and we are humbled by the positive responses we've received from planners, housing advocates, and local officials across the state. Again, I want to thank the team at DHCD and Mass Housing Partnership for their responsiveness, dedication, and flexibility in this massive undertaking. I know this won't be the last time you will hear from us, and I cannot overstate how eager we are to get started. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.